Okay. Can you all hear me okay? All right, thanks. I'll try not to eat the microphone this time. Okay, so my talk is just an overview of the seamless, overnight, non-disruptive NEED Act transition process. And just as a recap to start off from Thursday, it's the NEED Act is, the whole idea behind it is it's the minimal change necessary, and it's not radical, it's not scary, it's all in various parts, it's in place already. It's non-disruptive, it's seamless, and it's easy to implement because, again, all of the parts are already there, ready to go. And it's the structural reforms necessary to get monetary reform. And each part is there, and the principles and procedures are already in place. And just a reminder of what the Constitution says. The Constitution says we should have sovereign money, and really the US Mint was the first money issuer. It was part of the, well, it's now part of the Treasury, and they were issuing sovereign money, the coins. And the other types of money only came later on, because when the US was started, there were no banks. And the Treasury acknowledges that it has this constitutional power and that it can exercise it. And the top accountants in the country acknowledge that sovereign money, or US money, under the NEED Act is equity. And our coins that we use, our quarters and all that, that is a token of equity. That is a token of a share in the Commonwealth. This is a token of a drawing right on the capital of the nation and the society. The real capital, the real stocks of know-how, ability, culture, basically, as Oli said yesterday. Our culture has been built up over all the generations that went before us. Nobody knows who created the wheel, who invented it, who invented the lever, but we use these things every day. They're part of our cultural heritage and our cultural inheritance. So they belong to all of us. So we all have a right to a share in it. And that's the idea of the commons, I suppose, and the idea of real capital. So the top accountants in the country, they know what seigniorage is, and they know that it adds to the government's assets without adding to the government's liabilities, so that it's a net asset, which another word for net asset is equity. So when coins are issued, the government's net position increases. Now it's important to note here that seigniorage is accounted for as an inflow of resources, but it does not involve taking anything from anybody. It appears as though there's been an inflow, but really it's a creation, an origination. And so it increases the net position of the nation, basically, because a money share is everybody owns that, you know. So this is what it looks like on a balance sheet when sovereign money and seigniorage occurs. See, it increases the assets, the cash balance, but there is no increase in liabilities. So the residual is there's an increase in the net position. Another word for that is equity. And Dr. Kumhoff, he liked that, and he put it into his Chicago Plan Revisited paper published by the International Monetary Fund. And I really love these phrases that he puts in there. Money is properly treated as government equity rather than government debt, which is exactly how Treasury coin is currently treated under US accounting conventions. Government-issued money, which represents equity in the Commonwealth rather than debt, is the central liquid asset of the economy, or should be. And that's what he says it would be with the Chicago Plan Revisited after he did this conversion. So the three elements in the Need Act, really there's only three basic reforms or changes, structural changes, is to put the Fed in the Treasury. That means the system of Federal Reserve banks become a bureau alongside the Bureau of the Mint and the Bureau of Engraving and Printing. So you have all three forms of money, coin, currency and deposits, all issued under one roof. And the Federal Reserve Board is abolished and replaced with an independent monetary authority. And it would be more independent than under current law, which I showed you on Thursday. Under current law, the Fed comes under the Secretary of the Treasury. In the Need Act, there's actually protections for the independence of the monetary authority from the Secretary of the Treasury. So it actually makes the monetary authority and monetary policy more independent of the administration or the government of the day. The second major reform, structural change, is to stop banks creating what we use for money. And that's done with a simple accounting change, which I've got graphics on so you can see it visually, because it gets quite wordy to explain it otherwise. And then the third part of the reform is that you have to replace the money that was being created by the banking system with additional money as the economy grows. And so you create that in democratic ways for the general welfare, because the Constitution says that the federal government is supposed to promote the general welfare. Well, and one of the ways that in the Need Act is suggested is that we do that by using that money to repair and regenerate our infrastructure and our education system, among other things. So again, the three key words to really understand what the Need Act is all about is equity. I've already been over that. Bailment. Now what this means is safekeeping. And so this is what happens to money accounts or deposits at banks. They become basically as though they're electronic safety deposit boxes. So they're custodial items. They're not affected by the lending and borrowing activities of the bank. They're off that part of the bank's balance sheet. They're basically on a balance sheet that what we call a miscellaneous item, and which is where custodial items are recorded on the balance sheet. And so bailment, it really means that the money is your asset and it's not a liability to anybody else, which is what coins are like now, and it just passes from hand to hand. So the ownership changes with transfer or transaction. And so whoever is the holder of the money is the owner of the money, and the bank is merely entrusted to be the safekeeper of the money, which is what we're sort of taught from early age, is what banks do, and it's, and they actually would do it with the Need Act. So an everyday example, just to get the idea of bailment, is self-storage garages where you store furniture if you're moving house or whatever, and you still own that furniture, but you put it in the self-storage place, and the self-storage place is responsible for looking after it for you and keeping it secure. And that's basically what banks would do with your money. Now the other main key word is fiduciary, and that basically means that somebody is looking after your interests, acting as your agent, and that would mainly come into play when you have a savings or investment account with a bank and you entrust them with some of your money to help them fund their lending and investment activities. And so they have a responsibility to you to do that carefully. So this is what basically a simplified version of a bank's balance sheet now, and you see that deposits are part of the liabilities of the bank. They're basically the bank's promise to pay you money or transfer you money, as Professor Huber explained earlier today. So they're taken off the liability side of the bank's balance sheet, and they're put into miscellaneous items as custodial items. And you see there's a black hole there. So if that black hole remained, when all the outstanding loans that already exist on that day of conversion, when they're all that money, which is now money that doesn't go out of existence when loans are repaid, it would become permanent. If that black hole was left there, then after a period of time, the banks would have collected all the money back and kept it, and they'd have the whole money supply, which would, not be good. So we need to replace that deposit liability with an equivalent liability to pass through that permanent money into a revolving fund in the Fed, which is now a bureau of the Treasury, to then recirculate and recycle that money back into the economy to maintain the money supply. And banks, they know how to look after custodial items because there's already rules about that, and they record them, and they keep securities as custodial items, they keep all sorts of things as custodial items. So there's already all the rules and regulations and regulators to look after that. So now there's one thing that is also to be pointed out here, that deposits are not the only liabilities that banks have, because banks do borrow among each other, and they do borrow from the Fed. So that's the other liabilities there, is borrowings. And on the asset side at the top, the banks still keep their cash. They still keep the reserves and the vault cash and all of that. So, and that's what they borrow. Banks don't borrow deposits from customers because they create the deposits for customers. What banks borrow is the reserves from other banks or from the Fed. So that's what they use to borrow and lend with, and they still have that. So they will be able to repay their borrowings with the same money that they borrowed. And so all of that trail of borrowings would be able to be unwound in the same way that it was wound up in the first place. So there's no problem with banks being able to satisfy their other liabilities in the same way as they do now. And so there's like 4 banks with the Fed in the middle, and you can imagine it going in a clockwise direction from bank to bank and back and forward between each bank and the Fed. And then afterwards it would go in an anti-clockwise way to unwind all of that history of previous borrowings. And the money would be returned to the Fed that had been borrowed from the Fed. So that's why we have to have this obligation to pass through the money that returns to the banks from previous borrowers and pass it through to the revolving fund. And so the principal and interest is paid in the normal way from borrowers to the banks. The banks pass through the principal to the revolving fund, and they keep the interest as their income like they do now. And from their interest income, they pay their staff and they pay their expenses, and they distribute dividends to their shareholders and all of that stuff. So interest does get recycled back into the economy. As I mentioned on Thursday, the only part of it that doesn't is retained earnings, and that's a function of all sorts of organisations, not just banks. So that is possibly a reason why the money supply needs to grow a little bit, but it's a relatively small factor in the big scheme of things. And the same thing goes on at the Fed. The Fed their liabilities is mainly reserves, in the same way as banks' liabilities are mainly deposits. And the Fed sometimes, well, maybe it doesn't really borrow, but so the same thing happens. The reserves don't need to be liabilities of the Fed anymore. They become just custodial items that the Fed looks after for the banks in the same manner. And so now you see that there's these assets on the Fed's balance sheet, which is called the system open market account, and that's all the assets that the Fed buys when they were doing quantitative easing, or even before quantitative easing. That's what they used for their what's called open market operations, where they buy and sell government bonds and other securities to balance their balance sheet to issue reserves to the banks. So that's no longer needed anymore. The Fed doesn't need to hold those assets, and really those assets represent the debt of the people in the nation that has been used to underpin the banking system's money creation through credit and risk. So that those assets really belong to the people in the nation, and so they can be returned back into the system, and it amounts at the moment, well, last year it amounted to about $4.2 trillion in the system open market account. So those funds can be sold back into the market, and the proceeds can be used to distribute a citizen's dividend to everybody, because, as I said, that system open market account assets, all of that represents what we the people had pledged to underpin the banking system. And so now we're changing the system so we don't need to do that, so we can use the proceeds of that to distribute a citizen's dividend. And you see that there's also enough left over, in the figures last year, to also basically cancel out the student debt. And so Jim Wirt's going to work on some language for a revised Need Act to make that an education provision retroactive, so that student debt is basically cleared, erased, yeah. So we can do that. That's what you can do when you change the money system. So again, this tax-free citizens dividend, if you took the $3.2 trillion, that would be $10,000 for every man, woman and child, and that would enable them to get out of high interest debt like credit card debt and other consumer debt, which at the time amounted to $3.2 trillion. So it basically enables people to get out of the very high interest debt that they have. I mean, but we don't force them to do that. If they want to do something else, well, that's their business, because it's their money. It's nobody else's business. And again, it wasn't money that was taxed from anybody. It wasn't money that was borrowed. It didn't add to the national debt, so it should be no concern to anybody. And and we need to have that to get money reflowing back into the economy quickly. When, as loan repayments come in from the banks, it needs to be re-injected back into the economy to maintain the money supply. So this is what it can do for inequality. It can basically reduce it from a situation of it doesn't look right. Oh yes. Yeah, it can reduce it from a situation of a disparity of 5 to 1 to 3 to 1, just with that, using this example. And there's the outstanding student debt at the time. And again, the proceeds from the sale of the assets can be used to give a tax-free citizens dividend sufficient to wipe off student debt and consumer debt. And as the debt is paid off, that returns back to the banks and is then able to be used again in the revolving fund. So the revolving fund is always collecting and issuing money. So that's what a reconstituted Fed would look like. It would still make loans to banks if necessary, and but the money would be held in custodial accounts. So this is how banks would make payments with the reform system. Within the same bank, it's exactly the same as now. It just transfers from one account in the bank to the other account in the bank. Between banks, it would be a direct peer-to-peer payment system without the complicated, convoluted system that Joseph Huber described this morning. And so this is what Edgar was sort of describing with e-currency. It's a direct peer-to-peer payment system, and it's not at risk. It's not dependent on the solvency or liquidity of the banks at all. It's separate from the bank's solvency and liquidity issues. So even if banks fail, they can fail because the payment system remains intact. If a bank fails, all that happens is that you nominate which other bank you want to send your money to, and then they'll look after it for you. So there's no systemic risk in the system. There's no systemic risk in the banking system. So, possibly some of the onerous regulations could be reduced as well, because the whole system couldn't collapse. And so banks would make loans in the way that 99.9% of people think they do now, which is they take money from savers and investors and pass it through to borrowers. And as this money circulates in the economy from the citizens' dividend and from other payments, from paying for roads and education, paying teachers, paying contractors, that money can be used to pay off a whole string of debts, because at the moment we've got a huge debt overhang, and Steve Keen's probably going to be talking about that a bit later this afternoon. And so this is a way that everybody can be paid, all the creditors can be paid, rather than having to take big haircuts, which is what they're really facing at the moment. So banks would just make loans in the way that most people imagine they do now. They'd take in savings and investment funds, pool them, and then lend them out to various borrowers and other investments. And they'd be recorded that they've received money from the customer, lent it out to another customer, and then it's just unwound when the loans are repaid, and then the saver or investing customer can just decide whether they want to reinvest it or whether they want to transfer some back into their checking account. Be up to them. And lending can still carry on between banks. If one bank has a surplus of funds that they've collected and another bank needs some more because they've got some good investment opportunities, they can just borrow from other banks like they do now on the interbank lending market. And banks can also borrow from the revolving fund as well. And there can be a policy interest rate that actually is effective. At the moment, the federal funds rate is less than the amount of interest that the Fed is paying on reserves, so there really is no effective monetary policy at the moment. So the government's sources of income for the budget would have seniorage added to it, which means that taxes could be reduced and borrowing could be reduced because it's supplemented with seniorage. And so the Treasury has other channels of money coming in to be able to supplement the funds it needs to meet its budget to make its expenditures and public investments. And we've already got hundreds of programs. Like I said on Thursday, there's a tureen of alphabet agencies and lending programs that are out there to distribute funds. So nothing new really has to be invented there. And it's to create money for the general welfare and full employment. Direct funding for infrastructure, there's the report card from the engineers. That's what was needed in 2009, that's increased now. But I worked out in Congressman Kucinich's office that the federal part of that would create 7.2 million jobs. The 2013 report card increased the funding shortfall to 3.6 trillion, so that pro rata would be about 11.8 million jobs. And these are good career jobs for people leaving high school and college and university, and research and development, all those things. Funding education, like Steve Walsh said, it'd be much better if you had one teacher for every 10 or 15 or 20 students instead of one teacher for every 20 or 30 or 40 students. So there's lots of things that can be done, and it covers pre-K through to post-secondary 2 and 4 year institutions. And also the 25% of the money is distributed directly to the states on a pro rata basis, so they can use that for their infrastructure and education programs as well to supplement the federal grants that they receive through the various federal departments. And so education is a good. They say it's the best investment you can make in a society. So that was Robert Poland. He did a study and he found that education was what created more jobs than military spending or tax cuts, just across the board tax cuts. So that creates more jobs in education as well, more teachers, more preschool, early education, early childhood education, further education, vocational education, retraining people for the new sorts of jobs and vocations that are going to be needed in the 21st century, which is what we need to transition, to a more sustainable economy. And another aspect is that because there's because the federal and state and local government debt is paid off as it comes due, and the federal government in normal times wouldn't need to borrow anymore, that means that the interest bill on the federal budget reduces to zero, and there's an interest-free lending facility for state and local governments, so their interest bill on their budgets would reduce to zero as well. So that means that the federal, state and local governments can have an opportunity to reduce the taxes on people, especially property taxes at the local level, which are increasing quite a lot, especially here in Chicago. It's quite an issue. So this enables local governments to ease the burden on their citizens and on their constituents. There's the interest-free lending facility. So that reduces taxes on workers and businesses. It enables people to have more disposable income. It enables businesses to invest in new equipment and new staff. And the citizens' dividend sort of primes the pump for having a much more prosperous economy and enabling people to get out of debt and out of the debt mountain that they're under. And the long-term sustainability of social security can be assured because, as well as the contribution system, it can also be, assisted with seniorage if necessary, and supplemented with seniorage. And these are some other parts of the Title V, what Reverend Coates called the bread and butter issues. And another aspect that arises is that because the federal government is no longer issuing treasuries, that means, because what happens at the moment when other countries export to the US, payments go to their bank in the US and they basically don't want to hold it as money. If they're not going to buy anything, they invest in treasuries and they're held by the Fed in custodial accounts, but because there won't be those treasuries to buy, that means that those funds will have to be used for investment in the private sector, like for corporate bonds and other sorts of investments in the private sector, or they'll have to buy US-made goods in return for the goods that were imported from overseas into the US. So that is a factor that promotes balanced trade with the rest of the world. And so really the US's trade deficit is really only from a few countries, and I was going to go into something else, but how am I going for time? What time? Okay, I've got 5 minutes, is that right? Okay, I'll go into that in question time. But basically, another thing that helps promote trade is that balanced trade is that banks won't be able to just mark up on their liabilities side extra deposits to balance assets that they hold with correspondent banks in other countries, which means that banks will actually have to source those funds in current accounts or checking accounts which pay no interest, because in the Need Act your checking account doesn't pay any interest and instead charges a fee. So that will encourage anyone who accumulates funds, including exporters to the US, to use those funds rather than to accumulate them. And so that will help promote balanced trade as well. So doing that can, what are the things that other countries want to buy from the US? Well, it's things like Boeing aircraft, high-tech manufacturing, things like that. So that's going to be a boost for the high end of manufacturing in the US, which really needs a renaissance. And the US is still a leader in things like that, and I think they will continue to be, because you need to have a country of a certain size to sort of develop an aircraft industry. A small country is not going to develop an aircraft industry. So, the US is well positioned to really take advantage of new technologies and high-tech manufacturing, which again creates good jobs, good career opportunities for people leaving high school and college and university. So last year I lost this table, but when I was in Congressman Kucinich's office I added all these factors up, and it worked out to be about 47.2 million jobs, and that was working off the 2009 Civil Engineers report card, and since then we've had the 2013 report card, and so pro rata that works out to over 50 million jobs. And so I've revised that, and we've got this on our website, and it's also in your kits, just a rundown of these job creation factors, and it works out to 52 million jobs roughly. So that's basically full employment. That basically is about the same as the amount of the working age population that aren't participating in the economy at the moment. So that basically means genuine full employment, which is something that's possible, because in New Zealand we had genuine full employment in the 1950s and 1960s, and even into the 1970s. So it's not something that's an unachievable goal, because it has been achieved in other countries in the past. And so there's all sorts of work that can be done, making our world a nicer place to live, a more beautiful place. As Edgar said this morning, he was upset by the ugliness, and he wants to live in a beautiful world, and so do I, and I'm sure that all of you do as well. So, and we can regenerate our cities like Detroit. It's becoming like a place with urban gardens, and a whole lot of artists and creative people are moving there, and it can be a model for a new 21st century green city. And so when you break things down to the municipal level, this is the amount of jobs and extra funding that would go to Detroit. So that's over 100,000 jobs and over 4.7 billion in funding per year going into the community. Same thing for the Michigan state, over 1.6 million jobs, over 68 billion of additional funding. Here's for Chicago. We heard from Mr. William Bergman from Truth in Accounting yesterday what a dire situation Chicago is in, but with the NEED Act pro rata, because everything in the NEED Act is distributed on a per capita basis with adjustments for different cost factors in different areas. And so that would be about over 400,000 jobs and $18 billion each year coming into the Chicago city economy. And for Illinois overall, it would be over 2 million jobs and over $89 billion. So basically that clears their deficit hole and their debt hole that they're in, which Mr. Bergman spoke about, and it enables the city and the states to honour their retirement and healthcare systems for their employees, which at the moment are under attack. And for New York State, that's over 3 million jobs and 137 billion in annual additional funding into the state economy. And for California, over 6 million jobs and over 270 billion of additional funding into the state economy. So for financial markets, it'd be a great boost in investment in the private sector, because there wouldn't be this wasteful investment in government debt, which really, that's not what investment is about. Investment should be about, investing in things that people want to create. And also, as Michael Kumhoff's study from the Bank of England showed in his paper, Banks Are Not Intermediaries and Why This Matters, the financial system would be, and the banking system would be much more stable. It wouldn't be pro-cyclical like it is now, because banks are euphoric and create far too much money in the upswing, and then they become very pessimistic and create far too little money in a downswing, and so that amplifies the effect of any sorts of cycles and ripples that might be out there. And but with a loanable funds system, where there's funds moving back and forward between savers and borrowers, that's a sort of a fixed, or relatively fixed within a range amount of money, so there can't be these huge fluctuations. So and Dr. Kumhoff proved this with his DSGE model, which is what all the central banks use, that it would be much more stable, and so you wouldn't have this volatility and all that. And so because banks won't be able to create money at will, they won't be able to create money for speculators to gamble on short-term, margin currency speculation and all that sort of thing. So currency exchange rates between countries should become much more stable, as well as the effect of the balanced trade that I talked about before. And also banks will be on a level playing field with every other financial institution, like mutual funds, real estate investment trusts, insurance companies, pension funds. There's no reason why one part of that financial system should be given the privilege to create money when all the others have to go out and get the money before they can do their business. It's a completely unfair advantage that banks have. So what the NEAT Act does, it basically ends the unemployment crisis, it ends the debt crisis of the national debt, pays off the national debt as it comes due, which incidentally sort of stops the war machine in its tracks, because the war machine can really only work when you've got this rolling over of the national debt all the time. So if the federal government had to actually go to the taxpayers and say, we want to start a war and we want to increase your taxes by 200%, from 20% to 60%, well, I don't think that government would last very long. So they'd be voted out of office within 2 years. So, and it ends the fiscal crisis at the federal, state and local level. It gets the state and local governments out of the financial holes that they're in, and ends the financial crisis by stabilising the financial system, and also enabling all creditors to be paid off, rather than this bubble which, if it bursts, means a lot of people will go unpaid and lose their wealth. And it makes the US dollar a stable currency because of these effects I was talking about, not having currency speculation. Having a low or no inflation environment would make the US dollar an even more attractive asset to hold than it is now. So, but it would maintain its purchasing power, because the amount of money in the economy can be directly correlated with what's going on in the economy, as indicated through inflation and interest rates, what's happening to them, and adjustments can be made directly. At the moment, whatever the Fed does, it's pushing on a string, because it's the banks that create the money that we use, and if they don't want to create it, they don't create it. Nobody can force them to, and nobody can force borrowers to borrow it into existence, which is, the situation we're in at the moment is, there's things that need to be done, but everybody's already in too much debt. They don't want to take on any more debt, and you all know the story. So it's a no-win situation at the moment. But with the NEAT Act, it's a win-win situation. And why do we want this? Well, like I said, and as Edgar said, we want a beautiful world that's sustainable and enriching for the kids. Thank you.